Okay, question 6. This comes from Charlie and Ellie, and you've both asked some fantastic questions, so I'm going to run through them all again. So Charlie, you've asked, how can I make my lawn as lush as possible but tough to play football on? And it's a good question. It's quite a hard thing to get something that looks lovely in green and that's tough enough to play on. And big football clubs like Everton and Liverpool and teams like that, they change their pitches really regularly, and that's how they keep them looking really nice. They just put fresh turf down quite regularly, definitely each season, and that keeps it looking really fresh. So when you see that on TV, it can look like they've got it looking really nice all the time, but they cheat a little bit. The key is probably giving it plenty of water and allowing lots of sunlight onto it. That's the things that the grass needs most. And to cut it, but not very short, but regularly. So you need to get your mum or dad or whoever cuts it to cut it fairly high, so leave it long, but to cut it often. So you're just taking the tops off, and that gives you nice lush green grass that's able to withstand periods where it's very dry, or also periods where you're playing football on it. And obviously there's always going to be bits maybe around the goal or penalty box or places like that where you're going to put a lot more your feet more, and they're always going to suffer a little bit. But generally cut it high and get it lots of water. So I hope that answers your question. And then you've also asked, how do you make your carrots grow longer and straighter, which is a great question, and this applies for all root vegetables that are growing straight down, so parsnips and carrots and things like that are growing a taproot straight down. And the key is that they don't want to meet anything. So if they're growing straight down like that and they hit a rock, they're going to either stop completely or they're going to fork, so they're going to go sort of over the rock like that. So the key is to either plant it into something like, you could grow it in a drain pipe, so you could grow it so you know that you're just putting some fresh soil in with no rocks in it, so you could just make sure there's no rocks or anything, maybe add a bit of sand into the soil and you know it's not going to hit anything. Or if you're growing it in the ground, obviously you need to make sure the drain pipe's long enough for however long you want it. So if you want a nice long carrot, you could have it sort of really long, or if you want something, you could grow a bit shorter, but you do need to give it plenty of room. If you're growing it in the soil, you need to dig down and mix in, as I said, something like sand. Don't mix in lots of fertiliser because they don't really need it. They need sort of drainage and they need the root to go down. So I hope that answers your question. You then asked, which is very similar, you have 2 parsnip plants that are doing very well. How do I know when they're ready to pull up? And this is a bit like the beetroot question. The answer is that people like to eat them at different stages. So if you want to grow the biggest one, and just to be impressed by how big it is, leave it as long as you can. If you want to grow them to eat them, you can start to just move your finger around the top and just see how big the top of the stem is. And you might find it sweeter and juicier if you lift it out when it's not huge, but just a good size. So sort of about 3 centimetres across or something like that, 1 inch across. That might be perfect, but again, try it, pull some up, have a try, and you can pull up the rest if you think that's a good point to eat them. So I hope that answers that question. And then you've also asked, finally Charlie, you said, what is the easiest tree to grow for a shady spot in our garden? So trees normally grow up quite tall, and you don't need to worry too much about them being shaded. They tend to be shading other things. But there are some trees that grow quite happily in shade, and there's something called yew, which is a type of conifer and has lovely sort of dark green, sort of like needly leaves. That would grow quite happily. Acers grow very well round here in Ainsdale, and they grow quite well in the sort of shelter of the shade. They do need a little bit of sunlight, but they grow quite happily in shade. And then there's also something called Cornus kousa, which is beautiful and has lovely sort of big white flowers early on in spring, and that's really nice. So I hope those are good few choices. There are a few others, but they'd be really nice ones. So I hope that answers your question. And then Ellie, you've asked, we have sweet corn growing. Should we be doing anything to help it? And when do we know when the corn on the cob is ready to pick? So it's a great question. It's always tricky to know when to sort of pick things. So at the moment, the best thing to be doing is just be consistent with it. So if you've been watering it, keep watering it at the same amount that you have been doing. But if you've not been watering it, leave it alone. Just let it be. They do like lots of sunshine. Your second question is how much sun does sweet corn need to grow? And they do really love having lots of sun on them. So as much sun as possible is the answer to that, as much you can give them. They grow in very hot countries in sort of South America and places like that, and they get really lots of sunshine, and they do grow very happily in that. So give them as much as you can. So if there's anything, again, if there's anything shading them, best to sort of move that out of the way if you can. And then they're ready to eat. You'll see the corn on the cob, what's the husks growing, and they have like a little, it looks like a little tuft of hair. I haven't got any, but most people have a little tuft of hair, and it sticks out the top, and at the moment it'll probably be kind of a yellowy greeny colour, and they're ready to eat when that turns brown, so it looks like it's dying off, that very top bit, and inside then it should be ready to eat. Obviously maybe try just picking one. If all of them have gone like that, try picking one, check it is ready, and before you pick all of them, but that should be a sign, and you'll just need to peel back the husks. So I hope that answers your question. You then asked about the sun on the sweet corn, so it's lots. Then you asked, what do we do with our strawberry plants at the end of the season? They were new this year. So strawberries are great, obviously lovely things to grow. They do so well in summer. And when they've finished and you've got all of the fruit off them, the best thing to do is definitely cut off all of the dead leaves. So any leaves that have died off, you could leave them a little bit longer just to get a little bit of energy into their sort of, they kind of overwinter as like a little sort of crown of leaves. So you can definitely cut back any dead leaves or anything that looks diseased. If you've put any straw, sometimes people put straw around them just so that the strawberries don't fall onto the ground. You can clear that away, cut it off, and some people actually cut off almost all of the leaves and leave just the crown. And if you might have put netting over it to stop birds coming and stealing your strawberries, because they do love them as well. You can pull that off because the birds can come and peck around. There might be some bugs and things like that they can clear out of the way, any mouldy bits of strawberries that you don't want there. And to cut it all off like that, and then that'll be great for next year. If there's any what are called long runners, so it's like a bit of stem with a new, what looks like a baby plant on it, you can take those off and you can put them into a pot. There should be quite a few normally. Put those into a pot, and then you've got some fresh ones for next year. And they reckon that a strawberry crown, so one plant, the original plant, that'll keep on producing a good number of strawberries for about 3 years, and then you might need a new plant. So take those runners off and start a fresh plant from that. So I hope that answers your question. And then finally you ask, how do you cut a bush to be half the size without killing it? And this feels like you're speaking from experience here, Ellie. It sounds like you've gone and hacked down a plant and killed it. So the answer is it depends on the type of plant. Some bushes and trees you can't really cut down. They just grow slowly, and then if you try and cut them down, that'll kill them. So it does depend slightly on the plant. So plants like hebes and conifers, really you can't really prune them. They'll keep growing, and if it gets too big, realistically you can't do much about it other than taking it out and starting again. Other plants, something like a hydrangea or a buddleia, something like that, those kind of plants you can prune, and it really depends what you want. If you want to keep them the same size that they are, you could cut out each year about 1/3 of the stems, and you could cut those right down to the ground level. And that way you keep, if you do that every year and take out a few of the stems, it'll never get huge. Or you can take all of the stems and reduce them down by 1/3, so it keeps it all in control. And then next year, cut it down by 1/3, and slowly you'll get it so it's just slowly reducing like that. So I hope that answers your question. I hope you haven't killed any of your parents' bushes or anything like that. I'm sure you haven't. So. All right, thanks for the question. Question 7. This comes from Bobby and Rory. And you've asked, how tall can cherry blossom trees grow? So it's a good question. In this country, cherry blossom trees and cherry trees, because they're quite similar really. Cherry blossom trees, you do still get some small cherries, but really you're growing them for the flowers. Cherry trees have pretty flowers, but you're also growing them to get the sweet cherries at the end as well. So they tend to grow to a maximum of about 50 feet tall, because that's still quite tall, it's still quite a big tree potentially. Most of them don't get up to that kind of height, but that's how tall they can get up to. But I just double checked because I wasn't quite sure. So apparently the largest of the cherry trees that grow in America, they can get really quite big. So there's something called the black cherry, and that is also known as the rum cherry, and that can grow up to 80 feet tall. So it's not far off double the height of the ones that will be growing in this country. So it can get to be quite tall trees. So I hope that answers your question. They are lovely trees. They tend to be absolutely beautiful for a very short period in the spring, And then at the end of the summer into autumn, you get that lovely leaf colour that is absolutely beautiful. So they are lovely trees to have, and the birds will often eat any little cherries that are produced. So I hope that answers your question. And then you've also asked, how can we help our blue Christmas tree grow thick and healthy branches all over? Only one side of the tree is growing. So blue Christmas trees and conifers generally, once you cut into the old wood, so if you imagine it like your arm, the hairs on my arm are like the leaves, and you could take those off and it wouldn't be a problem. But if you cut my arm off, it wouldn't regrow. I wouldn't get a new hand on the end of it. And conifers are the same. So you can trim them, you can take off the hairs, the leaves, but you can't really cut into the old wood, it won't regrow. So it depends what's happened with your Christmas tree. If you cut off some of the stems to what's like a wood or a branch, that won't regrow from there. If you've just lightly trimmed it, or maybe it's not getting enough sunlight, then it might regrow. And you might get some growth off the trunk possibly. So what I would try and do is, if it's not getting the sun on the dead side, the not growing side, try turning it or cutting other things back around it so it can get some sunlight and some room to grow, and that might help. As I said, unfortunately, if the wood's been cut into, it might not regrow. In which case, you could take anything off and just put it up against something, up against the wall, so you can only see the front side of it and then not worry too much about it. If you bring it into the house, you can always just stick it up against the wall and just decorate the front. So have a little look at it. If you want to see it, you can send me a picture if you want, and I can just give you a little bit more advice if I can see it. But I hope that answers your question. Thank you. Question 8 comes from Toby and Alex, and Toby's asked, what do bees do to make flowers bloom? So the bees don't actually make the flowers bloom in a sense. The flowers are already blooming to attract the bees to them. So they will, if they want bees to pollinate them, other flowers might want a different type of insect to come to pollinate them, and there's some flowers that get pollinated by flies, some that even get pollinated by slugs. So it depends on the type of flower, but if a flower did want a bee to come to it, so a lily is a really good example, they have like a little drink of nectar down in the bottom, and they want the bee to go down, and then its furry body gets covered in pollen, and then that moves that pollen onto the next flower that it goes to, and hopefully it's the same type of plant, and that it will be able to then set seed. It might move on to a different type of flower and get some pollen, get some nectar from that, and the pollen will just land on that plant and it won't be a problem. But if it moves to another type of its same flower, then it will be able to let that flower set seed. So the flowers are blooming to attract the bees, to get them to pollinate them, to get them to set seed. So I hope that answers the question, if that makes sense. Okay, and then Alex, you've asked, how do worms make soil? And that's a really good question, because worms really are vital to keeping our soil healthy. And as they eat their way through, so underground they're eating their way through things like dead leaves, but also parts of soil, actual just what we would think of as soil, big chunks of it, and bits of manure and things like that that are under the soil, and roots, anything like that. It passes through their body and they break it down, and then they poo out what we think of being nice soil. And that's all broken down. It's got lots of nice air pockets in it. It makes it easier for it to be have water into it as well. So it's perfect for the plants to then use it to then grow nice healthy flowers and fruit. So they're really important. So basically they just eat it. They eat it. They put it through their body, it breaks it down, and then the soil that we're then growing the plants in is kind of worm poo. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much. Question 9 comes from Zach and Zara, and you've asked some fantastic questions. So your first one is, how can we see colour? And it's a really good question, and colour that we see in things like leaves of plants and things like that is caused when the sunlight comes through our atmosphere, and you can see this when it's broken up into a rainbow. You can see all the different colours that the white light that we see is coming from the sky is broken up into. And as that hits something, so a leaf of a plant, and particularly leaves, they're absorbing lots of that light. And those plants are then using that to make energy, so they're turning that into sugars and starch. And then it's reflecting out the light that it doesn't need. And the light that leaves don't need is green light. They don't need that for making that sugar and starch. They use all those other colours, but just not green. So that light's reflected out. So when we see anything, any colour, so when you see the colour of my shirt, the sunlight is reflecting off it and bouncing out, and it's giving off the colours that it's reflecting. So it's absorbing some and reflecting others. So that's why we see different colours. So I hope that answers your question. And then you've asked, why do we get hiccups? And I must admit, I suffer from hiccups quite often. And it's caused by a spasm in our diaphragm, which separates the, what does it separate? It separates it's the muscle that separates the chest from the abdomen. And it's important in breathing. And it causes that sound when we go like that. It's sort of just opening and closing really quickly. And that's what causes it. I don't know why. I don't think anybody knows why it happens. It just does. I think it's your muscle just, when you think of how often you breathe in and out all day, every day, you're doing it overnight while you sleep. Every so often, I think it's just probably just letting you know that it's there. It's just checking it's working. So I'm not exactly sure why it happens, but that's what is happening. Why it happens, I don't know. Maybe you could ask somebody else. A doctor maybe might know, but that's as good as an answer as you'll get from me. I hope that's okay. So, and then you've asked what colour are germs? So that's a great question. I had to look that one up. I wasn't sure on that one. So apparently bacteria, so that's often what germs are. Bacteria is often white or kind of a creamy colour, but it can be all sorts of colour. We were having breakfast as a family, and my wife was eating was about to eat some yoghurt, and the bacteria in the top had turned the yoghurt pink. So it should be white, and it had turned it pink. So, and apparently bacteria can be all sorts of different colours, from gold, which would be quite exciting if you got gold on top of your yoghurt or whatever, but it could be gold, could be red, could be any colour really. So, but apparently mostly creamy white. So I hope that answers your question. And then you've asked, why do we have grass? And that's an interesting question. And grass has evolved to be eaten by things like cows and deer. And it's one of the very few species of plants that can be eaten very low down and then regrow. If other plants were eaten as often as, or cut as eaten as often as grass is, they would die, they wouldn't be able to cope with it. But grass kind of rejuvenates, it grows back from just right down by the roots. So the reason we have grass is that it covers a big area very easily that we can keep short and walk on, and almost no other plant could do it. So you couldn't have almost anything else apart from things like pebbles or paving or a floor like that. So that's why we often grow grass. But also it makes the other plants look really nice. So if you have some plants growing by a nice grass lawn, it makes those plants look really nice. The green colour sort of enhances how they look. So if you've got a more unusual coloured plant growing next to it, it really highlights it. So you look lovely green grass, and then you see the plants growing. So that's why people grow grass often. And even when people don't want to have grass that they mow, they'll often have artificial grass, which looks the same in a lot of ways. So I think people just appreciate the look of it. So I hope that answers your question. And then you've asked, why is wood the colour of pale cream inside? And you are right that most wood that we use for building is that kind of colour. When they cut it, and even when it's treated, it's often that colour. But not all wood is that colour. You get woods like redwood, which is red, and then you get all sorts of other colours, from very dark browns to almost whites to lots of other colours. So I think it's just that we see there's a few different types of wood that we use for building buildings and furniture and things like that, and it's that colour. And I think most plants, when you cut open the inside stem, so tree's just a big plant, isn't it? That inside of that is white because it's not having to get the energy from the sun, so it's not photosynthesizing. So maybe white's the easiest colour for that to be, because they put all the kind of green pigment on the outside. They don't need it to be green, so maybe it just defaults to kind of creamy white. And roots are often that same colour. So I think, although most of it is, not all wood is that colour. So I hope that answers your question. And then you've also asked, why are Asian wasps coming to the UK? And Asian wasps are actually a type of hornet, and they're becoming increasingly seen in this country, and I think they came over on a shipping container from France, from Europe, and I think generally they're able to cope more in this country because of global warming, and I think things are getting warmer generally, milder, and they're able to survive, whereas before maybe when we'd have had a colder winter they wouldn't have been able to survive. They are now, and I think they are slowly moving up the country, but I think they are trying to keep on top of them and get rid of them. So I think generally the reason they're able to move through the country is that it's getting milder. So I hope that answers your question. Your mum has sneaked in an extra question. We'll allow it just for this once. So Karen has asked, why can't I grow coriander? I've tried from seed and got a few spindly seedlings and then plants, but they don't bulk up, just stay as single strands. So assuming that you're growing them in pots, and they will grow quite happily in the soil as well, and I think really you're probably just expecting something a bit too big almost. Maybe just grow them and just take the leaves, grow lots of seedlings and just take the leaves off instead of expecting one big plant. Just grow it in and take the leaves off it as it goes. So that might work, and you can try sort of staggering sowing the plants so they come up and you can just take them quicker and grow them almost like as a kind of quick crop and just take the leaves off like that. And I think the other thing they really respond well to is I think they don't like to dry out. So you might find that kind of keeping the plant moist might help. If you're growing them out indoors, it might be the sunlight levels as well. So if you're growing them outdoors and they're still doing it, it might be that you're just expecting them to get too big and maybe just eat them smaller. So I hope that answers your question. And then you've also asked, the oak tree at their caravan has gone very thin. I think you mean thin like my hair is. The leaves are falling off. And you said, is it the time of year already for the leaves to begin to fall? And you said that you miss going up regularly to see it due to all the COVID restrictions. So trees are quite, we sort of think of having a spring and a summer and an autumn and a period over the winter when they lose their leaves. And actually the trees sort of make up their own rules as they go really. So they'll often lose their leaves if they go through a very hot dry spell. They'll just get rid of the leaves. It's too stressful for them to keep it. They're trying to lose too much. They're losing too much water through the leaves. So it could be, depending on where the tree is, I'm not quite sure where your caravan is. It could be that that's just in a particularly dry little spot. It might not have been dry this year, but that might be on a hillside or something like that. And it's got too dry, so it's got a little bit stressed. It's maybe set its seeds, so it's got rid of its leaves now, and it's just happy to do that. It could also be the other way, that it's got too wet, and that could also be a problem. And again, if you get slightly stressed because it's too wet, it might just lose its leaves. It tends to be a response to it being a bit stressed if it's losing its leaves really early. I would say it's probably just naturally doing it now. It's probably just kind of decided that it's had enough of this summer. It's maybe set its seeds and it's just had enough. So I hope that answers your question. All right, thank you very much.